In the year 800 AD, on Christmas Day, over 3 centuries after Romulus Augustus, the last Western Roman emperor, a new man would be given the title of Caesar and proclaimed Emperor of Rome. His name was Charles, the second of his name in his dynasty of Carolingians, and he came from a people that the Romans would consider barbarians, the Franks. This man would establish an empire that would stand the test of time for just over a millennium, be remembered as Charlemagne or Charles the Great, and leave such an enormous mark on Western culture that he would be dubbed the father of Europe. Who was Charlemagne and how did he create his empire? Where did his people come from? What did he do to single-handedly change the course of European history forever? These are the life and deeds of Charlemagne, the father of Europe. The Franks were a group of Germanic tribes originating in modern-day Germany. The first encounter between the Romans and the Franks came during the 3rd century AD, when the Franks crossed the Rhine into Roman territory. They permanently settled into the province of Gaul during the early stages of the migration period, where they eventually established a kingdom. The Franks were originally not united under a single ruler, until a chieftain named Clovis united all Frankish tribes under his rulership and established his dynasty of Merovingians, who ruled the Franks for nearly 2 centuries. The role of the Frankish king, however, quickly diminished in importance and became more of a ceremonial position, similarly to the European monarchies of today. Frankish kings were still important, however, as even without significant power, they were still the figure keeping the Franks united. The power instead came into the hands of the mayors of the palace, a role originally intended to serve as an advisor for the king. Thus, with the emergence of the mayors of the palace as the main leaders of the Franks, the power of the Merovingians was overtaken by a new dynasty, the Carolingians. The first Carolingian who rose to prominence was Charles Martel, or Charles the Hammer, receiving his nickname after decisively defeating a sizable Moorish force at the Battle of Tours and putting an end to the Muslim ambitions of acquiring territories north of Iberia. The mayors of the palace were supposed to be elected democratically by the Frankish nobility, but by the time of Charles Martel, the position had become hereditary, much like the title of king. Upon Charles Martel's death, his 2 sons Pepin and Carloman were supposed to rule over 2 separate parts of the Frankish realm. Carloman, however, was more interested in living the life of a monk than meddling in Frankish politics. For this reason, he forfeited his position and left his brother Pepin be the sole mayor of the palace. Over the course of his early reign, Pepin managed to establish close relations with the Pope by granting him lands in Italy and effectively establishing the Papal States. Seeing that the position of Frankish king was essentially redundant as it held no royal power, Pepin sent an indirect request to the current Pope Zachary, implying that the position of Frankish king should be merged with the position of mayor of the palace, and thus the ruling king Childeric III should be forced to abdicate in favor of Pepin. The Pope agreed to his request. Childeric was dethroned and forced into a monastery, making him the last Merovingian king. Pepin was then unanimously elected as the new king of the Franks. Pepin tried to continue his father's legacy by expanding the Frankish realm and fighting the Moors to the south, but unfortunately his rule was short-lived. He died during a campaign in Aquitaine only 10 years into his rule as king. The Franks had adopted a type of succession which stated that upon the death of a ruler, all of his sons should inherit equal parts of the realm. This was a common practice in Western Europe at the time. Its goal was to promote cooperation between the sons of the ruler and to avoid instability and overextension. However, in a lot of cases, the new rulers had different political interests and refused to work together. This is exactly what happened upon Pepin's death. Charlemagne inherited the outer parts of the kingdom on the sea border, while his younger brother Carloman inherited the middle and southern parts of the realm, including Burgundy and the eastern parts of Aquitaine. The 2 brothers were supposed to rule the realm as one entity, but their refusal to cooperate made it so that the kingdom was effectively split into 2 realms. It is uncertain as to why the 2 leaders of the Franks disliked each other, but immediately after their rise to power, they began to quarrel and try to prove their superiority over one another. A conflict which solidified Charlemagne's claim to power as Pepin's firstborn son, and diminished Carloman's reputation in the eyes of the Frankish nobility. The feud between the 2 brothers ended with Carloman's death shortly after his ascension to the throne. It is unclear what the cause of Carloman's death was, but it has been attributed to natural causes. Carloman's wife and children fled the realm following his death, and Carloman's vassals pledged their loyalty to Charlemagne, once again uniting the Franks under one king. Charlemagne received his reputation as a warrior king, as he spent most of his reign extinguishing rebellions within his own realm, repelling enemy attacks, or conquering foreign territory and expanding it. This kind of lifestyle was expected from a Frankish king, and his Carolingian ancestors had also spent the majority of their rule campaigning. Shortly after the death of his father, Charlemagne was met with his first challenge that would mark the first of his many campaigns. The region of Aquitaine was one of the most unstable regions of the Frankish kingdom ever since its acquisition by Charles Martel. The rulers of Aquitaine were always of questionable loyalty, and shortly before Pepin's death, the region had once again revoked its loyalty to the Frankish kingdom and declared independence. Pepin was unable to respond due to his deteriorating health and later death, so the handling of the rebellion was fully in Charles and Carloman's hands. The two brothers were supposed to cooperate and subdue the region, which was split under both of their domains. But Carloman refused to aid Charles, letting him deal with the rebellion by himself. Charles was looking to avoid a pitched battle and instead fortified his position near Bordeaux, after which the leaders of the rebellion elected to surrender instead of meeting his army on the battlefield. This marked Charles' first successful campaign as King of the Franks. The next major campaign for Charles was against the Kingdom of Lombardy. The Lombards, similarly to the Franks, were a group of tribes of Germanic origin who had established a kingdom in northern Italy with the fall of the Western Roman Empire. They were now ruled by a king named Desiderius, a former ally of Charlemagne's. The two rulers had established an alliance by Charlemagne marrying Desiderius' daughter shortly after his ascent to power. The relations between the two kings had deteriorated, however, after Charlemagne requested for the marriage to be annulled, electing to marry a different woman instead. Desiderius was now in conflict with the Vatican, marching on Rome after a territorial dispute with the Pope. Charlemagne took the Pope's side in the dispute after the established papal-Carolingian relations by Charlemagne's predecessors. Once again, Charles elected to avoid a field battle and instead decided to besiege the Lombard capital of Ravenna. The siege was successful, the territorial dispute resolved in the Pope's favor, and Desiderius dethroned in favor of Charlemagne, who now owned the majority of the Italian peninsula. The campaign in northern Italy was not the only major campaign of Charlemagne's to the south. In fact, right after he returned from a second campaign in Italy, where he had to deal with a regional revolt, he was visited by envoys from four major Muslim cities in the northern parts of Iberia, namely Zaragoza, Barcelona, Girona, and Huesca. A new major player had risen in Iberia, a member of the Umayyad dynasty named Abd ar-Rahman, who was looking to bring the entire peninsula under his influence. The emirs of the north found themselves in a desperate position as they were loyal to the Abbasids, who were enemies of ar-Rahman, and they bordered the Christian Franks to the north. As a last resort to get out of their predicament, they reached out to Charles and offered their vassalage in exchange for military support against ar-Rahman. Charles, seeing their offer as an opportunity to decrease the Muslim influence in Iberia and return Christianity to the region, accepted their offer. Marching through the Pyrenees Mountains, Charlemagne was greeted as an ally in the cities of Huesca, Girona, and Barcelona. Once he continued south to the last supposedly allied city, he was denied entry and informed that the Emir of Zaragoza had decided to withdraw from the deal. Angered by the treachery of the Emir, Charlemagne besieged the city, but was unsuccessful in taking it. Soon he was informed that the Emir of Barcelona had withdrawn as well, so he decided to abandon the campaign and return back to Francia. Marching through the mountainous region of the Pyrenees, his army was ambushed by a hostile force of Basques at the Battle of the Roncesvalles Pass. The Basques, seeking revenge for Charlemagne's increased influence in the region of Vasconia and their reduced autonomy, decided to betray the Frankish leader and attack his army. The Battle of Rendezvous Pass undoubtedly marks Charlemagne's greatest defeat. Even though the Franks would later seize parts of northern Iberia, including the city of Barcelona, Charlemagne himself would never set foot in Iberia again after this defeat. Charlemagne's toughest campaigns were in the north against a fierce enemy of the Franks, the Saxons. At the time of the rise of the Carolingians, some of the Germanic tribes such as the Franks, and particularly those to the south such as the Lombards, had converted to Christianity. Many tribes to the north, however, such as the Saxons and the tribes of Scandinavia, were still practicing their indigenous pagan religions. It is clear why he saw the Saxons as an enemy, considering they bordered his realm to the east and often launched raids on Frankish settlements. Charlemagne had launched an invasion into the Saxon lands before his campaign in Italy. During his first invasion, he destroyed a major pagan symbol in the region, a sacred pillar by the name of Irminsul. It is unclear exactly what the Irminsul was, but we do know that it was a major holy site for Germanic pagans such as the Saxons. Charlemagne ordered the destruction of the Irminsul as it was his clear intention to subjugate the pagan Saxons and convert them to Christianity. His campaign was an overall success. He managed to defeat the Saxon army multiple times and lead several successful sieges against his enemy. His campaign ended with the leader of the Saxons converting to Christianity and the majority of the Saxon homelands coming under Charlemagne's control. The Saxons were no less zealous than Charlemagne, however, and they were not eager to abandon their old ways and adopt the religion of their conqueror. Not even a full year after Charles' successful campaign in Saxony, a new pagan chief by the name of Wutkind rose to power and started a rebellion against the Frankish king. Very little is known about Wutkind and his origins. It is also likely that Wutkind was not even his real name, as it simply means child of the forest in ancient Germanic. Occupied with his conquest of Italy at the time, Charles had to return to Saxony to quash the rebellion once again. He was successful in subduing the Saxons for a second time, although Wutkind managed to escape and flee to the court of the King of Denmark, whose daughter Wutkind was married to. Seeing the resilience of the Saxon people, Charles decided to institute harsher measures to ensure his dominance in the region. A large number of Saxon nobles were executed for refusing to convert to Christianity, and new laws were enacted, making practicing paganism a capital offense. This would not be the last time Charles had to deal with the Saxons and Wutkind. The new laws that Charles instituted only led to more religious unrest, as some Saxon tribes converted to Christianity willingly while others did not. This provoked Wutkind's return from Denmark and the start of yet another rebellion, mainly targeting the newly established churches in the region. Even though Wutkind had more success in the beginning of his campaign, defeating the Franks before Charles' arrival in Saxony, the rebellion was once again unsuccessful, ending with Wutkind's conversion to Christianity and the final subjugation of the Saxons. The Saxon Wars were not the only campaigns that Charles led against the pagans east of his empire. The Avars were another foe of Charlemagne, who had established a state to the east. Originating in Asia, the Avars were a nomadic people who had settled in the Pannonian Basin 2 centuries before their clash with Charlemagne. Similarly to the Saxons, the Avar pagans were raiding Christian settlements within Charles' domain, which once again gave him a reason to pursue a war with them and subjugate them. Unlike the Saxons, however, the Avars were unable to put much of a resistance against the Franks, and their khanate was eventually brought to an end in the early years of the 9th century. The Frankish troops during the Avar campaigns were not led by Charlemagne, however. They were instead led by his sons, who at this point were ruling over large parts of the Carolingian Empire and trying to prove themselves as commanders in order to be experienced by the time they would have to rule the empire themselves. This was a common Frankish tradition, and Charlemagne was brought up in the same way, assisting his father during many of his endeavors. While his sons were busy with the Avars, Charlemagne was focused on extending his influence on another group of pagans, the Slavs. The Franks and the Slavs were never in openly hostile relations. Some Croats even aided the Frankish troops against the Avar khanate. While the Slavs were never subjugated and integrated into the Frankish Empire, Charlemagne contributed to their Christianization by sending missionaries and also influenced their culture in other ways. For For example, even in modern days, the word for king in many Slavic languages derives from Karl, the Germanized version of Charlemagne's name. On Christmas Day in the year 800, Charles was attending Mass at Rome. Little did he know, the events that occurred during this Mass would change his legacy in the course of European history forever. The Carolingian papal relations had gone a long way since Charles Martel, with Pepin's donation to the Pope establishing the papal state on the map of European politics, and Charles's cooperation with the Pope eventually leading to Carolingian dominance in the Italian peninsula. As the Carolingians had showed their piety and loyalty to the Pope numerous times, he once again sought their help in 799. The reigning Pope Leo III was ambushed by his political opponents as he was walking the streets of Rome. He was accused of adultery and perjury, and his attackers tried to cut off his tongue and tear out his eyes as punishment for his crimes. The Pope was almost beaten to death and rendered unconscious until Frankish envoys and their bodyguards managed to overpower the attackers and rescue the Pope. He was then brought to the Frankish ruler, where he was given refuge. A year later, the Pope returned to Rome, where, under pressure from Charlemagne, he was declared innocent of all the crimes that his opposition had accused him of, and his opponents were exiled. As the Pope's trial was in December, Charles decided to stay in Rome for Christmas. During the Mass on Christmas Day, unbeknownst to Charles, the Pope declared him Emperor of the Romans. This event holds historical significance for various reasons and is controversial for many others. The way that we view and understand the Roman Empire today is significantly different from how ancient and medieval people perceived it. Ever since the fall of Rome, many nations, people, and empires have claimed to be descendants of the Roman Empire, and many altercations have occurred as a result of disputes between them. The rulers of the Byzantine Empire, or the Eastern Roman Empire as they called it, have always viewed themselves as the continuation of the empire following the fall of the Western Romans. Since then, many Eastern Roman emperors tried to restore the former borders of the empire with limited success, Justinian being the most successful in doing so. Even after the fall of Constantinople, the dispute of the continuation of the Roman Empire continued, with the Ottoman sultans claiming to be Roman emperors by conquest, and even the Russians considering themselves a revived version of the Roman Empire, or a Third Rome, the title of Tsar directly deriving from the Roman title of Caesar. While such disputes might seem trivial without the proper historical context, the question of who the legitimate successor of Rome is unquestionably holds a great amount of importance. While to us the Roman Empire might seem like one of many empires that ruled over a tremendous amount of territory, our ancestors viewed it as the pillar of civilization, the empire that ruled the known world. Unlike any other empire throughout European history, the Roman Empire left such an enormous imprint on European culture, traditions, politics, values, linguistics, etc., that its legacy has become an inerasable part of the continent's history. Thus, any man who could establish himself as a legitimate successor of this empire could lay claims to all the glory and prestige associated with it. This is why Pope Leo III's decision to crown Charlemagne was so important. But there was one obvious problem. There already was an empire which was considered the successor of Rome. The Pope, however, had an argument against the Eastern Romans. The Eastern Roman Empire was at the time ruled by a female, a precedent which had never occurred in the history of Rome and would never occur again in the future. The reason for this is that ever since its creation, the Roman Empire held a strictly agnatic succession policy, meaning that no female could possess the title of emperor. This made Empress Irene an illegitimate ruler in the eyes of the Pope. Furthermore, he argued that upon the fall of the West, the empire had once again been merged into one, the Eastern Roman Empire being its sole successor. This all ended when Irene deposed her own son from the Byzantine throne, which rendered it vacant, hence why the Pope crowned Charlemagne as the new emperor, illegitimizing not only Irene but the Eastern Roman Empire altogether. The Pope also had a more pragmatic reason for proclaiming Charlemagne an emperor as well. It was the Roman Empire that was supposed to protect the Pope and ensure stability in Rome. The Byzantines were in no position at the time to fulfill this function, and it was the Carolingians who had cooperated with and aided the Pope in the last few decades. Understandably, the coronation of Charlemagne infuriated Irene and the Eastern Romans, but they were in no position to contest the title as their strength was vastly inferior. Not only that, but shortly before his death, the Byzantines recognized Charlemagne as a legitimate emperor in the West, fearing a military conflict with the Carolingian Empire over the city of Venice. The coronation of Charlemagne marked the beginning of what we know as the Holy Roman Empire, an entity which would outlive the Eastern Roman Empire by nearly 4 centuries. During the time in which the two empires coexisted, each of them would recognize the other one as an empire, but never accept its legitimacy as a successor of Rome. The Holy Roman Empire would continue to receive criticism long after its dissolution for bearing its name. Having the benefit of hindsight, many would point out that the empire was not deserving of being called the Holy Roman Empire, since it was not holy enough, not Roman enough, and not an actual empire, particularly during its later days. One fact is for certain, however. During the time of Charlemagne, it was all 3 of those things. It was holy as it was ruled by one of the most zealous rulers of medieval Europe, who made it his personal goal to spread Christianity as far as he possibly could and was heavily endorsed by the Pope in doing so. It was Roman as it served as the main protector of the Pope and the city of Rome, was influenced culturally and linguistically by the Romans, and had Latin as its official language. And finally, it was an empire not only because it was ruled by someone who had received the title of emperor, but it spanned over several kingdoms and ruled over a population of people coming from many different cultures, religions, and ethnic backgrounds. Nowadays, Charlemagne is often referred to as the father of Europe, and there is a major misconception for where this moniker comes from. A lot of people have the notion that Charlemagne is called the father of Europe because most, if not all modern Europeans descend from him. While it is technically true that most, if not all people of at least partially European ancestry descend from Charlemagne, it is not a characteristic that is exclusive to him. In fact, the same can be said for almost anyone who lived during his time or the people that preceded him, provided that their bloodline did not die off in a few generations. Instead, Charlemagne is known as the father of Europe because of what we call today the Carolingian Renaissance. The Carolingian Renaissance marked an era of unprecedented cultural and educational prosperity within the Frankish Empire, traces of which can still be found today. Charlemagne was not only a warrior like his ancestors, but he was also a erudite who cherished learning perhaps more than any of his contemporaries. He enjoyed listening to books being read to him while he was resting or eating, and he was an avid collector of books throughout his life. During this period, there was also another precedent which was quite unusual for the Middle Ages. Books were in such high demand that scribes could not produce them fast enough in order for everyone's needs to be met. Many private libraries were open instead, where people could borrow books, once again a practice which was not that common during the Middle Ages, as most books were stored in monastic libraries and were accessible by a limited number of individuals. There is also another popular belief about Charlemagne which might not be necessarily true. He's often believed to have been illiterate and to have never learned to read. While we have no evidence as to whether or not this was true, a man of his status would have undoubtedly had access to the best possible education in the world at the time, and it is unlikely that he was unable to read for this reason alone. It is also possible that this misconception derives from the fact that his chronicler Einhard, who assisted the Frankish ruler during his life and wrote a biography of his, implies that he was unable to write properly. It is also important to mention that Einhard describes Charlemagne as being able to speak 3 languages, including Latin and Greek, once again making it unlikely that he was unable to read either of them. Whatever the truth may be, Charlemagne's frustration with not being able to write led to one of the most important revolutions in medieval calligraphy. Prior to Charlemagne, there was no unified script which could be understood by educated people of all regions of Europe. Regional scripts were used instead, making it so that a person from one region might not be able to read something that a person from another region had written. Wanting to abolish this and make it so that a copy of the Bible in Latin could be read by any person from all parts of Europe, Charlemagne oversaw the creation of the Carolingian minuscule, a script which would introduce unified standards in calligraphy which would be practiced in all regions of the European continent. The Carolingian minuscule would introduce standards that we still follow today, such as spaces between words and a clear distinction between capital and lowercase letters, making reading a notably easier skill to learn compared to the time before its invention. Yet after all of his achievements, including effectively restoring the Western Roman Empire, Charlemagne died at the age of 72, not content with his achievements and wanting to have been able to do more. Regardless of whether or not the Frankish emperor felt like he had achieved all the goals that he had set for himself, it is undeniable that he will always remain one of the most important figures of medieval history and be known as someone without whom the course of history would have been vastly different. He is remembered by many names: Charles the Great, the Warrior King, the Father of Europe, and he is undeniably deserving of all of them.